During Dad's retirement celebration, my brother introduced me to his investor saying, "This is my sibling, evidence that success doesn't run in families." My parents laughed. The investor stayed silent, checked his phone, and said, "Actually, I'm withdrawing all your." My brother Ryan once called me a failure right in front of his main investor. And that same investor looked me up online afterward, which ended up helping sink Ryan's entire company within a month. But I'm jumping too far ahead of myself here because it all really started at Dad's retirement party, held in this upscale hotel ballroom with crystal chandeliers hanging overhead, white tablecloths on every table, and about 150 people gathered to celebrate his 40 years at the same company, and I was standing near the back like I always did, holding a glass of sparkling water, quietly watching everything unfold, because the back was my usual place, out of the way, unnoticed, nothing special, while Ryan was right where he always was, planted firmly at the center of attention, soaking it all in as the vice president of his own tech startup with Series B funding and a reputation as the big success story everyone wanted to hear about. And my sister Lauren was there too, polished and confident, a marketing director with a corner office and yet another achievement to brag about. And then there was me, Evan, the sibling no one really talked about, the one who supposedly took the wrong turn in life by dropping out of college in my junior year, bouncing through odd jobs, traveling, and taking my time figuring things out while everyone else sprinted ahead, until I eventually found my lane in freelance consulting focused on supply chain optimization, working remotely and earning a solid, comfortable living. Though to my family, I was still treated like a warning label, the example of what not to do, since I didn't have a corporate job, a flashy title, or business cards with impressive logos, just a different kind of life, which to them automatically meant a lesser one. And Ryan made sure I never forgot that with his usual comments about how I was still doing the freelance thing, always delivered with that pitying tone and tight smile, while Lauren would introduce me as the sibling who was still finding themselves at 32, and Mom would dodge questions by saying I was doing my own thing and very independent, which really meant they didn't want to explain it, and Dad barely acknowledged my work at all, changing the subject anytime it came up. So eventually I stopped bringing it up, stopped explaining, and just showed up to family gatherings, smiled politely, and kept my mouth shut. And Ryan finally arrived an hour into the party like he always did, making an entrance, never alone, dragging along his usual crew of co-founders, partners, and investors, including one man who stood out to me right away, Charles, a guy in his mid-50s wearing a perfectly tailored suit and an expensive watch he didn't bother showing off, quiet and observant, the kind of person who listens more than he speaks, and Ryan paraded him around like a trophy, introducing him as the lead investor in their $8 million Series B, which impressed everyone enough to line up for handshakes and startup questions, while Charles nodded politely and studied people instead, something I noticed because I tend to do the same, and observers always recognize each other. And about an hour later, Ryan spotted me in the back corner and flashed a wide smile that immediately set off alarms in my head as he walked over with Charles at his side and said I had to meet someone. So I stood up, and Ryan threw an arm around my shoulder and squeezed a little too hard before introducing me as his sibling Evan. And Charles shook my hand and said it was nice to meet me in a professional, neutral way. But then Ryan's smile stretched wider and sharper as he announced that I was living proof that success skips generations, which hit me like a punch even though I didn't react thanks to years of practice, while Charles simply watched without changing his expression, and Mom hurried over laughing loudly like it was all a joke, followed by Dad with a glass of champagne, gesturing at me while saying it was true since they had 3 successful kids, and then trailing off. And Lauren joined in by calling me the family cautionary tale, which sent Ryan, Mom, Dad, and even a few nearby guests into awkward laughter, while I stood there silently like I always did, used to being the punchline. Except Charles didn't laugh at all, and instead kept watching them as something subtle shifted in his eyes. And Ryan wasn't finished yet as he turned fully toward Charles and went into performance mode, comparing his role at a $50 million startup to Lauren's corner office and then waving at me with air quotes around freelance consulting, prompting Mom to add that they didn't really talk about it, and Dad to joke that you can't win them all, which got another round of laughs, while I watched Charles watching them, his face calm, but his jaw tightening just a bit as Ryan kept feeding off the attention and talking about how we all had the same opportunities, but some people just take longer to figure things out, if they ever do, with Lauren chiming in for the biggest laugh of the night. And I felt that familiar mix of heat, anger, and shame rise in my chest, but stayed quiet because I knew defending myself would only invite disbelief or dismissal. So I said nothing as Charles pulled out his phone and quietly scrolled while Ryan kept joking about how I was their reminder to stay humble. And when Charles finally put his phone away and looked Ryan straight in the eye to ask how much of the Series B funding had been spent, the group fell silent as Ryan answered about 30% and asked why, only for Charles to calmly say he was reconsidering his investment, which made Ryan laugh nervously and demand an explanation, and Charles, still calm, explained he was withdrawing his funding under the 30-day character clause, leaving Ryan pale and scrambling as Charles stated plainly that publicly humiliating your own sibling just to impress an investor told him everything he needed to know about Ryan's character, ignoring Mom's attempts to brush it off as family fun and locking eyes with Ryan as he said he'd spent 6 months evaluating the company. Your team, your leadership, the way you run things. All of it checked out and passed every test until tonight. And this whole situation isn't crazy at all because what you did was use your own family as a joke so you could make yourself look bigger in front of an investor, which isn't madness, it's calculated. And it's cruel. And when Dad tried to step in and said Charles didn't understand our family, Charles turned to him calmly and said he understood perfectly, pointing out that this night was meant to celebrate 40 years of success, and yet they chose to spend part of it tearing down one of their own children in front of strangers, which made Dad's face turn bright red before Charles looked back at Ryan and told him the decision was final. That formal notice would arrive the next day, and the withdrawal would be effective 30 days from receipt. And when Ryan's voice cracked as he begged and said his entire company depended on that money, Charles replied evenly that maybe he should have thought about that before deciding character didn't matter. Then he gave me a brief, respectful nod and walked toward the exit, leaving Ryan frozen in place watching $8 million walk away, while Mom, Dad, and Lauren all turned and stared at me like this disaster was somehow my doing. So I set my sparkling water down and walked out the other way, hearing Ryan panic behind me as he begged Charles to wait. But I didn't turn around because I'd spent 32 years being the punchline, and that night someone else finally heard the joke and didn't laugh. And I made it to my car before my phone started buzzing with Ryan calling, which I declined, then calling again, which I declined again as I drove the 45 minutes back to my apartment with the phone buzzing the entire way. And by the time I parked there were 14 missed calls, all from Ryan. So I sat there with the engine off staring at the screen, feeling that old part of me wanting to answer, the part that still hoped they might see me differently someday. But the louder part remembered Mom's forced laugh, Dad pointing at me with his champagne glass, and Lauren calling me the family cautionary tale. So I went inside, made some tea, sat on my couch in the dark, and let the phone keep buzzing with calls from Ryan. Then Mom, Dad, Lauren, and Ryan again until around midnight when I finally answered and said what, only to hear Ryan spiraling, saying he was completely screwed and asking if that was all I had to say, then explaining that Charles had sent the formal withdrawal notice, that $8 million was gone. Payroll wouldn't last another month. His co-founders were panicking, and other investors were asking questions, while I stayed quiet until he kept repeating my name and I told him I was listening, which led him to ask for my help, a request that almost made me laugh, because now he wanted my help, claiming I knew people and had connections through my consulting work. And when I confirmed that I did, he begged me to make calls or introduce him to investors, and when I asked why I would do that, he went silent before saying because he was my brother, which I answered by reminding him he was the same brother who'd called me a failure 2 hours earlier. And when he tried to backtrack and say he didn't mean it, I told him he absolutely did and always had, that the only difference was he'd finally said it out loud. And when he admitted he was trying to impress Charles by humiliating me, I agreed and told him I'd noticed. And even when his voice turned desperate and apologetic and he started talking about jobs and families depending on him, I told him he should have thought about that before turning family into a punchline. Then hung up, turned my phone off when it immediately started buzzing again, and the next morning Mom called from the landline, insisting on a family meeting and saying Ryan's company was collapsing and I could help. And when I said I could but wouldn't, she asked why. and I told her it was because she laughed loudly when he called me a failure in front of 150 people, and when she tried to minimize it as teasing. I explained that teasing is private, and what they did was public humiliation, then hung up, blocked her number, Dad's, and Lauren's, leaving Ryan unblocked just to see how desperate he'd get. And around noon an email arrived from someone completely unexpected, a former client who'd been at the retirement party and recognized me from the Walmart distribution project, telling me my work had saved their company $40 million a year, that I was one of the best consultants he'd ever worked with, and that what my brother said was cruel and wrong, which left me staring at the screen, realizing someone else had seen it all and understood my actual value, leaving me feeling both validated and embarrassed at the same time. And later that afternoon, Ryan forwarded me Charles's formal withdrawal notice, which I almost deleted until curiosity won. And when I read it, I saw the clean legal language, the 30-day notice, the clawbacks, and then one final paragraph citing the character and conduct clause and stating that after observing Ryan's treatment of a family member at a public event, the investor had determined a fundamental incompatibility of character and ethics, a decision that was final and non-negotiable, with Ryan's message above it saying everyone would know why. Now, and I closed the email thinking good, because they should, and that evening there was a knock at my apartment door, and when I checked the peephole, I saw Ryan standing there insisting he knew I was home because my car was outside, begging me to talk for 5 minutes. And when I stayed silent, he knocked again before finally giving up just enough to slide down the hallway wall and sit across from my door, pulling out his phone as I watched through the peephole. He just stared at his phone, ran his hands through his hair over and over, looking completely drained, and sat there like that for a full hour while I went about my evening, cooking dinner, eating, washing the dishes, and eventually checking the peephole again, only to see him still sitting there in the hallway. Until finally he stood up and left, his footsteps slowly fading away, and I realized I felt absolutely nothing about it. No guilt, no sympathy, just a deep, bone-level exhaustion. And 2 days later, another email landed in my inbox. This one from someone I didn't recognize, with the subject line Charles Chun reference, which made me pause because Chun, really? So I opened it and read that her name was Sarah Martinez, a Forbes reporter covering venture capital and startup funding. And she explained she was working on a piece about Charles Chun's recent decision to withdraw funding from Ryan's company, noting that during her research she saw my name mentioned in a 2022 Forbes profile on supply chain innovation titled The Quiet Revolutionaries, which highlighted 10 consultants reshaping American logistics, including me, for work with Walmart, Target, Amazon, and General Motors that collectively saved those companies around $140 million through distribution optimization. And she wanted to understand the connection between me and the funding withdrawal, since multiple sources mentioned a family incident at a retirement party, asking if I'd be willing to speak on the record. And I read the email 3 times, letting it sink in that Forbes was writing about this, about Ryan's collapse, about that party, about me, before replying with a simple no comment and asking not to be contacted again, because even though I shut it down, the damage was already done and Ryan's professional implosion was about to become public knowledge with the reason attached. And that evening Ryan called me from a different number, which I answered without thinking, immediately asking if I'd talked to Forbes. And when I told him no, but admitted they'd reached out and I'd declined, he started spiraling, saying this would destroy his reputation. And I told him calmly that he destroyed his own reputation when he called me a failure to impress an investor. And when he accused me of wanting him to fail, I told him the truth, that all I ever wanted was basic respect, and what was happening now was just consequence. And when he kept repeating that we're family like it was supposed to fix everything, I told him it should have meant something, but it didn't anymore. Then hung up and blocked the new number. And later that night another email arrived, this time from Charles himself, with the subject apology, which made my hand hesitate before opening it. And when I did, he wrote that he hoped I was well and wanted to apologize for putting me in an awkward position at my father's retirement party, explaining that when he Googles people it's usually just to verify credentials, and what he found in my case was a Forbes profile, 3 Harvard Business Review articles, and documentation of exceptional work with some of the largest companies in the country, and that watching my family mock me while being completely unaware of my accomplishments was striking and deeply troubling, and that his investment decision was based on character, because Ryan had shown a willingness to humiliate family for personal gain. which wasn't someone he could do business with, adding that I deserved better and offering to be a reference or make introductions if I ever needed them. And I sat back and read it again, realizing he was apologizing to me for being the first person who'd actually noticed what I'd lived with my entire life. So I wrote back thanking him and telling him he had nothing to apologize for. That what happened that night was normal for me, and he was just the first outsider to see it and care. And after I sent it and closed my laptop, I smiled for the first time in 2 days. Not because Ryan was falling apart, but because someone had finally really seen me and decided I was worth standing up for. And after that, everything unraveled fast, with week 1 bringing missed payroll that I knew about only because Ryan texted me at 3 in the morning saying employees were quitting and begging me to respond, which I didn't. Week 2 bringing other investors pulling out as word spread through Charles's tight network about the character clause and the retirement party, because investors talk and red flags travel fast, and Ryan had become one. Week 3 ending with his co-founders resigning, taking severance, and jumping ship while his LinkedIn quietly advertised for strategic advisors, meaning desperation, and by week 4 the company folded entirely, assets sold, lease terminated, website gone. And just 5 months after Ryan proudly introduced Charles as his lead investor, the startup no longer existed, though. Ryan posted a vague, professional LinkedIn message about lessons learned and moving on, drawing supportive comments from people who didn't know the truth, except in certain VC circles where everyone knew exactly what happened. And when our cousin Emily texted me saying she'd heard the Real story from a friend in venture capital and that Ryan's name was toxic now, I said good. And when she called that cold, I told her it was accurate, which made her laugh before telling me she'd always known I was doing well and followed my work, especially that Walmart project. And when she asked why I never corrected them when they called me a failure, I asked if they would have believed me. And when she admitted probably not, I told her exactly. And then on day 31 after the party, Dad finally called, because I'd unblocked him out of sheer curiosity. And when he said we needed to talk and admitted he'd been thinking about that night and how they treated me, I stayed quiet and let him sit with it. We were wrong, Dad finally said. And when I asked if that was really all he had to offer, he hesitated and asked what else I wanted him to say, and I told him I didn't know. Maybe forgiveness someday, which led him to ask when, and I answered honestly that it would be when I was ready, not when he needed it. And after a long silence he accepted that and said fair enough, then added that Ryan was struggling now, that he'd lost his company and his reputation and was applying for jobs, but getting rejected because he thought people knew what happened. And I told him they did know because Charles's network was small, influential, and fast-moving. And when Dad asked if I'd told people, I said no, but Charles had, not publicly, just inside investor circles, which is how that world works. And when Dad's voice hardened and asked if I was okay with Ryan being blacklisted, I told him I wasn't okay with anything. I was just not stepping in to stop it. And when he pressed again, asking why I wouldn't help, I reminded him that Ryan had publicly destroyed me to benefit himself and that he'd made a calculation, and this was the result. And when Dad repeated that Ryan was my brother, I told him that meant nothing compared to being the person who called me a failure in front of 150 people to impress an investor, because those aren't the same thing. And after another quiet stretch, Dad apologized, not just for that night, but for all the times before it, admitting they should have treated me better, which I agreed with. And when he asked if I could forgive him, I said I didn't know yet, and he accepted that too, saying he understood and to let him know if it changed. And after we hung up, I felt no anger or satisfaction, just tired. And by week 6, Lauren finally texted me for the first time since the party asking if we could talk, and when I asked about what she said everything. So I called her to get it over with, and she apologized, saying that night got out of hand and everyone was joking until it went too far, which I shut down immediately by reminding her I was standing right there when she called me the family cautionary tale. And that wasn't a joke, it was how she saw me. And when she went quiet, I asked if she'd been uncomfortable when Ryan mocked me, when Mom laughed, when Dad pointed at me, and after she admitted it was awkward but still joined in, I told her that made it worse, not better. And when she tried to explain herself, I told her she meant it. Always had, and just never expected anyone outside the family to care. And when she said that wasn't fair, I told her it was completely fair, because she assumed Charles would laugh along, and that mocking me was safe since I was just Evan, the dropout, the disappointment, until someone finally called them out, and now suddenly there was regret, which I told her was really just regret over consequences, not accountability. And when she pleaded again and listed everything that had gone wrong since, including Ryan losing his company, Dad's party ending in disaster, Charles putting the reason in writing, and Forbes working on a story, I told her those were consequences, not apologies, then hung up and she didn't call back. And in month 2, the Forbes article finally published without naming me, sticking to professional standards, but clearly explaining that a prominent tech investor withdrew $8 million in Series B funding after witnessing a founder publicly humiliate a family member at a private event, citing a character clause and ethical incompatibility, while noting the family member was actually an award-winning consultant featured in multiple industry publications, and the irony of a successful professional being mocked as a failure by someone about to lose everything wasn't lost on the investment community. And the piece spread fast through startup circles, with LinkedIn lighting up with commentary about character matching more than pitch decks. And even though Ryan wasn't named, anyone in his network knew exactly who it was. And Emily texted me saying the article was brutal and that Ryan must be dying. And when she asked if I felt bad, I told her no, really no, because he did this to himself, and she agreed. And in month 3, I received an email from a Fortune 100 retailer I'd never worked with, referred by Charles Chun, asking if I'd be available to discuss a major supply chain optimization project, and I stared at it, realizing Charles wasn't just defending me or apologizing. He was actively opening doors, and I replied yes and set up the call, which turned into a massive 8-month engagement with a 7-figure fee, all because of one conversation at a retirement party, which had done more for my career than 32 years of family ever had. And in month 4, Emily sent me a screenshot of Ryan's updated LinkedIn profile, showing a new corporate job as a supply chain operations manager, not a VP or founder, just middle management with a decent salary and benefits. And she captioned it saying he'd been humbled. And when I zoomed in on his photo, he looked older and worn down, and I replied good. And when she asked if I'd ever talk to him again, I said probably someday when he'd actually learned something. And when she asked if I thought he had, I said I didn't know and didn't care right now, which she said was fair. And in month 5, I was working at a coffee shop when someone approached my table, and I looked up to see Robert Chun, the client who'd emailed me after the party. And after we shook hands, he sat down and told me he'd been recommending me to everyone he knew because my work on the Walmart project was transformative. But more than that, watching how I handled myself at my dad's party with dignity and silence impressed him even more than my consulting work. And when I said I hadn't really done anything, he smiled and said exactly that I didn't fight or perform or make a scene. I just let my work speak for itself. And when someone finally looked closely, they found exactly what I'd built quietly without needing recognition. And when he stood to leave, he told me to keep doing what I was doing. And I realized he was right, because my family underestimated me, and that was their loss. The people who actually matter are paying attention. And after he walked away, I sat there with my laptop still open and my coffee going cold, and realized I'd spent years trying to prove myself to people who were never really looking. And the moment I stopped trying so hard, the right people found me anyway. Which felt ironic considering Ryan lost everything trying to impress one investor, while I gained everything just by quietly doing solid work. And that irony wasn't lost on me, even if the satisfaction felt very real. And 6 months after Dad's retirement party, Ryan showed up at my apartment again. But this time I let him inside, and he looked different, smaller somehow, worn down by months of rejection and professional isolation. And we sat across from each other in my living room with the coffee table between us and silence hanging in the air until he finally admitted he'd lost everything: the company, his reputation, his savings, and even had to move back home for a while before landing a logistics job. And I just nodded without saying much because there was nothing to add. And then he said he deserved it and apologized not just for that night, but for every joke, every comment, every time he made me feel small so he could feel bigger. And I watched him closely, expecting a performance or an angle, but instead saw genuine exhaustion and real remorse. And when I said okay, and he asked if that was all, saying he wanted forgiveness, I told him I didn't forgive him. And when he asked if I ever would, I said maybe someday, but not today, which he accepted. And after another stretch of silence, he asked if I'd always known how successful I was, about the Forbes profile and everything. And I told him of course I knew because I did the work and gave the interviews. I just never told him. And when he asked why, I explained he probably wouldn't have believed me anyway, which he admitted was true. And when he stood to leave, he stopped and told me he was proud of me and should have said it years ago. And I agreed that he should have, but said I heard him now. And after he left, I sat there for a long time feeling neither triumphant nor vindicated, just tired. And 2 years later, I found myself at a major industry conference with supply chain professionals from all over the country, where I was giving the keynote on quiet innovation and how small changes create massive savings. And the room was packed with 400 people, standing room only as I talked through the Walmart project, the Target restructuring, and the optimization principles most companies miss. And people listened closely, took notes, asked smart questions, and afterward backstage Ryan approached me, looking healthier and more settled than before, and told me the talk was really good, explaining he'd seen my name in the program and had to come. And when I asked about his job, he said he'd been promoted to senior manager, not flashy but honest work, and after an awkward pause he admitted he'd been reading my articles and that I was genuinely respected in the field, even in Forbes, and said quietly that he never even looked before, which I confirmed. And when he said it would have changed things, I told him maybe, but he should have treated me well regardless, and he agreed. Then mentioned he'd been working with a therapist who helped him understand he felt threatened by success he couldn't categorize. And since I didn't fit his definition, he dismissed me, which tracked. And when someone called my name and I excused myself, he told me again he was proud of me, and I walked away without turning around. And later that evening at the hotel bar, while I was decompressing alone, Marcus sat down beside me and complimented the speech, explaining he was on an advisory board and sat in on sessions, and we talked industry trends over drinks before he asked about Ryan. And when I told him he was different now, Marcus said that was good not for Ryan, but for me, because it meant I didn't have to carry anger anymore, which he was right about. And I finally thanked Marcus properly for that night and for seeing what was happening and acting on it, though he brushed it off as a business decision rooted in character, adding that my brother needed to learn actions have consequences. And when I told him I was doing the best work of my career partly thanks to his referrals, he smiled and said he only opened doors and I walked through them. And after he left, I sat alone, thinking about Ryan's face in the audience earlier, watching me speak and seeing me respected and valued, everything he once claimed I wasn't. And instead of feeling revenge or victory, I felt complete, like I'd finally proven something to myself that I needed to prove, not to them, but to me, that I was enough, that my path mattered, and that quiet success counts just as much as loud success, maybe more. And when my phone buzzed with a text from Ryan saying he was proud of me and meant it this time, I didn't reply right away or delete it either, just let it sit there, not forgiveness yet, but maybe something like it someday. And the next morning over breakfast with Robert Chun, who'd also attended the conference and wanted to discuss another project, he commented that I'd come a long way since Dad's retirement party. And when I asked if I had, or if people just finally started looking, we agreed it was probably both. And as we talked business, he asked one personal question, whether I regretted how things went down with my family. And after thinking it over, I told him no, I only regretted that it had been necessary. But not that it happened, because I spent 32 years trying to prove myself to people who had no interest in actually seeing me. And then in one single night, someone finally did look, really look, and saw exactly what was there all along. And yes, that someone was Marcus. Because Marcus only paid attention in the first place when my brother tried to use me as a prop to make himself look impressive, which backfired completely. And people like to call that karma, but karma suggests some kind of cosmic justice when really this was just actions colliding with reality. And when Robert smiled and pointed out that was a very consultant-style answer, I shrugged and told him that's what I do. And about 6 months after the conference, I got an email from Dad with the subject line checking in, saying he and Mom hadn't heard from me in a while, that they'd seen my name in the business section again for another award, and that they were proud of me and would like to see me if I was ever in town. And I read it twice before replying with a simple thanks. I'll let you know, because I didn't plan to visit, but I also didn't feel the need to slam the door shut, since some bridges don't need rebuilding. They just need to be acknowledged as burned, and that's okay. And now in the present day, 3 years after the retirement party, Ryan and I text occasionally in a surface-level, professional way. Sometimes he asks for advice on logistics problems and I answer, because we're not close, and probably never will be. But we're also not enemies, just two people who share DNA and the history of one of us finally learning what the other was worth. And Mom and Dad send holiday cards while I send polite thank you notes. And Lauren and I don't talk at all, mostly her choice, maybe partly mine. While Emily and I still get lunch when I'm in town because she was the only one who knew all along and the only one who bothered to ask, and Marcus and I exchange emails every few months with professional updates, the occasional referral, and mutual respect, and my business is thriving with 3 Fortune 100 clients, 2 book deals in negotiation, and speaking engagements around the world. Everything Ryan once said I'd never be, not because I proved him wrong, but because I stopped trying to. And last week a package arrived from Ryan, and inside was a copy of Forbes, the original 2022 profile, with a note that said he finally read it all the way through and that I was always successful. He just wasn't looking, and that he was sorry it took so long to see it. And I put the magazine on my shelf next to my awards, certifications, and published articles, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the people who matter will find you when you stop performing for the people who don't. And that sometimes the biggest success isn't proving anyone wrong, but realizing you never needed their approval to begin with. Because my brother once called me a failure to impress an investor. That investor Googled me. My brother lost everything. And I gained everything, not out of revenge, but because I was already successful and someone finally took the time to look. And that made all the difference.